of the West, settlers moving west, railroad expansion, Native American conflict with settlers and the United States military, culminating in the end of the frontier and the completion of Manifest Destiny. Okay, we'll start with the PowerPoint, Conquest of the Far West. And there you see the expression came to being in the 19th century, known as Manifest Destiny. It is a phrase that was written by Thomas Nast, completed by James K. Polk, President of the United States, and ultimately, in the end, the relocation on reservations of Native Americans and territories that will eventually become states. And the United States would basically, it's God's providence for the United States to rule from sea to shining sea. And you see the portrait with the angel holding a Bible, guiding the settlers. That's the portrait of Manifest Destiny. Look at the geography of the West. Before moving west, towns in Missouri were thought to be the end for the frontier. And we might want to take note of the definition of frontier, which is unsettled land in western United States. West is considered states beyond the Rocky Mountains like Oregon, California, etc. There are deserts, mountains, rivers, lakes, basins, plateaus, mesas, and even volcanoes. Of course, the natives, 11,000 years ago, the Sioux, the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Blackfoot will probably be the tribes, the Great Plains tribes. They make up the most of the tribes west. They will put up the most resistance. I should not, check that. The Apache and Navajo did as well. Down in the, if you can't see it, the writing's a little light. Let me throw it out for you there. Navajo, Apache, the famous chiefs that we will be reviewing, Cochise, followed by Geronimo. There's also, in the module that I will place this video, in the module for Conquest of the West, or the New West and the South, there are two videos. One's Conquest of the West, if you choose to watch them. It complements these videos, recordings, and PowerPoints. And then there's a specific video documentary on Geronimo, which is good, if you so choose to. All right, well, we'll take a look at the railroads. Now, there are three modes of transportation that are going to completely change the way Americans live, starting with the railroads, then, of course, the automobile and the airplane. And it's not only just the railroads being able to transport settlers, resources, minerals, timber, crops. Communication is going to be faster. If you had to travel by land with a wagon or horse, it takes months. 7 days when the Transcontinental Railroad is complete, you could hop on a train in Boston, go all the way to Sacramento, California in 7 days. They would go, all trains carried miners, ranchers. So the world's becoming smaller. Not only that, but telegraph lines would be built alongside the railroad tracks, which made communication. So here's your, you can, as well as I do today. Now, you get on a cell phone, you can communicate all over the world in seconds. But this, for their time, the telegraph is their cell phone. And the mode of transportation is much faster as well. Railroads, automobiles, airplanes also influence the materials that are railroads, the materials that automobiles, the materials that airplanes are made of influence, steel, rubber, fuel, glass. In some cases, some trains that carried passengers, there was some elaborate upholstery, dining cars, even saloons and inns within the railroad themselves. And so upholstery, wood, iron in the beginning, but the iron rails will be replaced by steel because steel is more durable. We're really taking shape. Railroads have existed, but not a transcontinental railroad. And Abraham Lincoln basically summoned these two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to work together to complete a transcontinental railroad. Lincoln understood, as you well know, he's a busy man. Not only during these years does he have to be commander in chief of the Union Army during the Civil War, but he's also thinking ahead at what the country could be, what the transportation of goods could be, the growth of the United States, and he commissions these two companies. So the Union Pacific is going to go from here's the better map. This is better for you to see here. From Omaha, Nebraska, they're going to build west. Central Pacific's going to begin in Sacramento, California. They're going to build east. And the railways will meet at Promontory Point, Utah. The more difficult task was for the Central Pacific. So they would have the engineering is astounding. They would have to blast, use nitroglycerin, which is very dangerous. Very dangerous. 1,000 Chinese laborers died using nitroglycerin and dynamite. They risked their lives. Didn't make much money. And blasting through mountains, and trial and error, learning how to blast, the direction of the blast, and not to cave in tunnels that had already been dug through these mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, the Rockies, to get through. So as you can see, not that it was easier, not easy at all. Working on a railroad was hard labor all day long, but the Union Pacific did not have those obstacles in the way that the Central would. Union Pacific was mostly hired Irish laborers, and the Central Pacific, being on the west coast of the United States, China at that time was suffering from economic depression. Many Chinese immigrants came to the United States and sought work on the Central Pacific track. Great American story, a story of triumph, is one of the workers on the Central Pacific Railroad who managed to save his money, managed to stay alive, not get blown up by dynamite, and opened up a successful business in San Francisco. He moved from Sacramento to San Francisco, and he got married, had children, and his great grandson would be the first Chinese American to graduate from Stanford University. That's the kind of a American story that is a triumph. So managed to face discrimination, poor pay on a railroad, but yet his descendant would be the first to graduate from a prestigious university, Stanford University, in Palo Alto, California. Saw other obstacles, the trusses that had to be built. What was also, I didn't mention it, I'm sorry, right down here, Chinese workers received less pay. They were able to unionize themselves and go on strike and gain some sort of increase in salary. There was an incentive for both the railroads, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. If they finished under 10 years, they would both receive $1 million bonus. So they did not want work stoppage. So in this sense, the Chinese workers kind of held the owners of the Central Pacific at bay, saying, all right, well, you're not going to pay us anymore, then we're going to slow down. And the Central Pacific owners are thinking, well, we'll lose out on our $1 million bonus, but that can't happen. So they kind of gave in, which was interesting. Always negotiate from a position of power. In that sense, the Chinese had the position of power. This is a look at a map of all the railroad construction. Finally, well ahead of schedule. 1862 and 1864. If you get in 1862, so it took 7 years. So they made it underneath the 10-year mark, and they both received their $1 million bonus. And they met at Promontory Point in 1869. Here's a photograph of the event. You don't really see it there, but that pole that that man is standing on here would be, that's a telegraph line. And there was a telegraph sent to Washington, D.C. with just 4 letters, DONE. Done. Here's a great example of triumph and tragedy, the Homestead Act. Yeah, this was an option for many Black families who did not want to deal with slavery or managed to escape and fight in a civil war, but move out west. Out west, was there discrimination? Yes. Was there racism? Yes, but not on the level that there would be in the South and in the North, because out west was a little more dangerous. People did depend on each other to survive, so I think there was a little more of a level playing field. Um, Even cowboys, Hollywood paints a picture of a cowboy of this very tall, white, wearing a white hat on a white horse, gunslinging, desperados and all of that. Your cowboy westerns that Hollywood would stereotype incorrectly of what the West was like. And there were cowboys, Black, Spanish, Chinese, and they worked together. They had to, in order to move thousands of head of cattle. There couldn't be any kind of, you know, you're not going to do this because you're Black. You're not going to do this because you're Chinese. You're not going to do this because you're Hispanic or white, whatever. None of that. They had to work together, and that proved that diversity was successful. But the Homestead Act, 160 acres, live on it for 5 years. You develop it. You turn a profit, whatever crops that you grew, then the land is yours for a $10 fee. Well, in the meantime, most of that land had belonged to Native Americans. So here's the triumph and tragedy part. This is pretty much at the height of Irish immigration. In Ireland, many Irish tenants worked for English landlords. And that's pretty much generation after generation after generation. There's also a potato famine at the time. Double whammy. So let's take the Sullivan family, all right? Mr. Sullivan has a wife, 4 kids. And the United States also advertised this homestead overseas. So he was walking down, he finishes work and he goes to the pub to meet his friends, have a few whiskeys and a beer, and he sees this poster on it. It's this land, 160 acres, $10 filing fee, could be yours if successfully developed after 5 years. So he goes home, doesn't see much of a future for his children, takes a look at his kids, says, oh, he's going to be working for the landlord's son and so on and so forth. It's time to make a move. Tells his wife, sell everything you can. Now, passage on a ship, would be a little expensive, but not if he sells enough of his, and he might sell out his share to another tenant. He gathers the money. In other words, to make a long story short, he sails across the ocean. That's 3,000 miles. Lands in New York City. At that time, Irish landed in Boston or New York City. I'm going to take New York City. He goes to New York City. He's greeted by the Democratic Party leaders. At that time, in New York City, the Democratic political machine, as it was called, controlled the city's politics and votes. So Mr. Sullivan gets offered a job, a place to stay, and fast track citizenship. Okay. If he simply signs a piece of paper saying, I will be a Democrat, I will vote for the Democratic Party. The living conditions are horrible. The job conditions are horrible, but it's a place to stay. It's a roof over their heads. They lived in these tenant shacks. And then he has to work and save more money. All of his money pretty much went to the voyage to get his wife and 4 kids. Now, Months go by, saves up his money, and he goes out west. And usually they went together in parties, wagon trains, and they made it out west. So he gets there. He has a $10 filing fee. He puts it down. He has his land. So think about the voyage, the hardship, the perseverance. It's, that, wow. He has traveled close to 4,500 miles, 3,000 across the ocean, another 1,500 to get to, the mid United States, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, that territory where, homesteads were being doled out. And then someone says, well, they start talking, well, this land had belonged to Native Americans. Oh, that's the tragic part. The United States military settlers pushed Native Americans off the land. They'd been there for 11,000 years or so. And they're moved on reservations, and that land now belongs to Mr. Sullivan. This is one of those gray areas of history. There's no black and white. Whether you can take it and decide what's right or wrong on your own, and that one, whatever your opinion is. But the triumph is the Sullivan family. That's the spirit, the American spirit, going through that hardship of traveling 4,500 miles, taking care of his wife and his 4 kids, and finally making out, finally reaching pinnacle. And, for generations, his kids will be free. They won't have to work for an English landlord. They're going to be, oh, well, we took it away from them. And then there's the Native Americans that had been there for thousands of years. It's their home. So what do you think of that? And that's just what's one of the best examples of triumph and tragedy at the same time. It is tragic what happened to Native Americans. But you also have to tip your hat and admire the Sullivan family for their guts, courage, and perseverance. Homestead Act, I want to take notes on it. Challenges not only that the Sullivan family and others would face: no trees, especially in the plains, sod was used to build, had to dig wells for water, had to endure blizzards, hailstorms, tornadoes. That's scary. Fires, drought, and pests like insects eating their crops. That good old Yankee ingenuity, as they call it, inventions, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. Remember that phrase. Necessity is the mother of invention. The steel plow to farm and build sod, windmills to help pump water, barbed wire to keep cattle in or out, reapers and threshers to help harvest crops. Necessity is the mother of invention. So we have railroads, we have the Homestead Act for settlers to be able to use the railroads and other means of transportation, make it out there, establish themselves, establish towns, population growth. Minerals will also play a part, mining, boom towns, as they're called. This is where, if you're interested, and there are videos, we could spend an entire semester on it, but we do not have that much time, about the gunfighters, gunslingers, your White Earps, your Billy the Kids, Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, and others. There are great series on History Channel of the Wild West, the Old West, the gunslingers, Bat Masterson. As soon as, if I think of them, I'll mention. But I've watched them all, and it's quite interesting. And the mining towns, these boom towns, became that place because there really wasn't a law enforcement presence. But let me get to that. Okay, boom towns, because of silver, gold, lead, zinc, copper. One of the most famous silver mines was in Tombstone, Arizona. If you ever heard of the OK Corral and Wyatt Earp, the whole story that goes behind it. That was a great example of a boom town. And those miners you see, Crockett, in Nevada, Colorado, South Dakota, Arizona, as I mentioned. And people went out to strike it rich. But the people that actually made money were those that supplied these miners with tools. The people that made money were those that built hotels, restaurants, saloons, that provided food, provided all sorts of entertainment. Uh, use your imagination. Miners are out, digging for a week. They want to go into town. They get, they exchanged what they made for money, and they want to spend it. There were people that struck it rich, and they were wise with their money, invested in other business opportunities. But then there were ones that blew their money on drinking, playing cards, and female companionship, and would have to go out the next day and just start the whole process all over again. One famous story of a person that was successful is Levi Strauss. Those of you that might own Levi jeans, if you ever heard of them, he was one miner himself. He was a tailor in Germany, and the pants that he wore were flimsy, and he noticed they started to rip. So he actually takes material from his tent, cuts it out, and makes himself a pair of pants, and they were sturdy, tent canvas. And he noticed that the other miners, sometimes they worked alongside each other, or they, made deals like, hey, we'll work together and split whatever we find. But they noticed his pants were not ripping, and they were durable. And I said, hey, can you make me a pair? Can you make me a pair? So Levi Strauss finally just says, I'll make more money if I make these durable pants than trying to look for gold. And that's what he did. And lo and behold, we still had Levi jeans. Of course, he changed the material from canvas using denim and cotton to make the pants. And it's the boomtowns combined with the cowboys, the cattle drives. The United States and its cities are growing, immigration, it's all this cycle. We are covering, basically in the first 4 or 5 chapters, the growth of the United States from the Civil War on. But all of this is happening simultaneously. I mean, we're taking each part and we're reviewing it specifically, but you got to keep in mind it's all happening at the same time. So while the Civil War is going, immigrants are coming, cities are growing, people need to be fed. Better than to bring this beef, okay? Because there's a transcontinental railroad, yes, but not in the Southwest yet. So the cattle has to be brought to railroad junctions that are part of the transcontinental railroad. That's how the cattle drive begins. And the ranch, the cowboy, the dress, okay, the breeding were taught to settlers that moved out west by Mexicans, by the Spanish. Spanish that came here as conquistadors, conquered the Aztecs, created Mexico. They brought with them the skills of how to breed horses correctly, how to breed cattle correctly, hybrids, all the words that are associated, vaquero, cowhand, ranch, ranchero, lasso, rodeo is all Spanish in origin. And the Mexicans also taught Native Americans how to ride horses, how to breed horses, so on and so forth. So you have a combination of these cowboys and these miners, and they get together after the cattle drive and, mining for the day. They come together in these towns, and there's a sense of lawlessness. Usually the people in the town, either they probably elected a sheriff, or someone that had law enforcement experience might volunteer and then get paid by the city to be a sheriff. Not until U.S. Marshals are sent under federal authority will many of these cow towns or boom towns have any kind of law enforcement. So hence the myth of the Wild West and the gunslingers and the gunfights in the street and the rowdiness of the saloon comes about because of this. Okay, Native American life. We're mainly going to look at the Plains and the Native American tribes of the Southwest. The Plains tribes are the largest Native American group of the West. Remember that. Plains tribes are the largest Native American group of the West. Spanish, as I mentioned before, brought horses in the 1500s, changed their way of life. Usually they would have to hunt buffalo on foot. Riding a horse makes it easier. If you look at that picture, I'm sure there are some of you in this class that probably have experience riding horses, but I don't know if you can ride a horse without holding reins at full gallop, holding a bow and arrow or a spear, full speed, and be able to maintain balance on the horse while making the kill. That's took some skill to be able to accomplish that. Two, there's a difference, right? A difference between Native Americans and the settlers going out west. Native Americans hunted for one and used a part of that buffalo for food, of course, clothing, blankets, tools, jewelry. And they also understood if the particular buffalo they were hunting and their population was depleting, they laid off. That's why they preserved a lot of the food. They made jerky. Beef jerky was taught drying out meat by Native Americans. And they stored the food and waited for the population of the buffalo to replenish itself. You had about 30 million buffalo in 1865. But white settlers at that time had seen 1865 and 1900 buffalo hide becomes very fashionable in the East and in Europe. Europeans just had a taste for American fashion, the Wild West and the stories that they heard, that kind of propaganda. They want to get themselves some, leather boots and leather belts, and all of that comes from buffalo hide. So, buffalo hide hunters just went out and shot as many buffalo as they could, let it rot in the sun, didn't use or respect the population of the buffalo like the Native American Plains tribe. And that's one of the ways that white settlers dominated the Native Americans, by taking away their food source and just stripping them their hides and leaving them to rot out in the sun. That's one of the reasons it would force Native Americans to be to submit to the will of the U.S. government and moving on to reservations, because their way of life was being taken away from them. They would starve, and their children would starve, and other members of their tribe would starve. I'll put it to you this way: 30 million buffalo approximately in 1865. By 1890, there were only 30 buffalo left. You heard it right, 30. 30. So that's how much buffalo hides. And passengers on the trains, if they managed to train the Transcontinental Railroad going through the plains, open up their windows. If they brought most of them would be carrying 95% of men moving out west would have had a firearm. And just for target practice, a sport, shoot buffalo out the window. So one of the first government policies was known as the reservation policy or concentration policy. That policy is going to change in 1887, depending on the administration that the president and the vice president and the cabinet and Congress. Attitudes would change on what to do with what they call the Indian question. There was a government agency known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you see here, BIA, which was supposed to administer, bring food, bring seed, bring, supplies, part of the agreement that was signed between a Plains tribe chief and the United States government. These are conditions that were supposed to be met, but corruption, racism, of course, and Native Americans weren't used to reading and understanding or interpreting treaties that were written in English, so they could easily be manipulated, and they were. Every single treaty, for the most part, was broken. There is a novel, if you're interested in, it's called A Century of Dishonor. Look that up, A Century of Dishonor, which covers all of the treaties that were broken, which led to conflict, what were known as the Indian Wars. Here's a map: Bear Paw Mountain, Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, Sand Creek, the Fetterman Massacre, the capture of Chief Joseph, and we'll look at them, starting with Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. On November 29th, 1864, the peaceful Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, they had signed a treaty, massacred by a band of Colonel John Chivington's Colorado volunteers at Sand Creek, Colorado. In eastern Colorado, Arapaho and Cheyenne are trying to regain their lost land. And Chivington sends a messenger that the leaders of the Arapaho and Cheyenne should meet at Sand Creek. So the leaders of the Arapaho and Cheyenne are thinking, oh, here's the opportunity. Maybe we can get our land back peacefully. Unfortunately, Colonel Chivington and his men had way too much to drink. They ambushed the peaceful Indians and killed 105 of which were women and children. Now, understand this. There were journalists that went out west and covered what the West was like, and they sensationalized their stories when they wrote them and sent them back to the East for people to read. Commenting about how adventurous it is, how free and independent, and what an adventurous and great life you can lead out west, but you have to deal with those savages. So they planted in the minds the stereotype of the uncivilized savage, when people like Colonel John Chivington brutally massacred. So this would be considered, us journalists would write the Sand Creek the massacre as a heroic victory for the United States military and Colonel John Chivington, until historians went back and transparently wrote the truth about what actually happened. Now, of course, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Sioux would retaliate. And a lot of them are not going to take it standing still. They're going to fight back, and so they would raid settlers that were moving out west. That maybe they were far away from the railroad hubs. Okay, and they were still using wagon trains and wagon parties. They would gather in a circle with their wagons at night for protection. And after something like Sand Creek, of course they're going to retaliate. And when that gets covered, it makes it even worse if they retaliate and they attack and they kill women and children and white settlers. The story gets reversed, and the negative portrayal of the Native Americans, that's the one that people believe. There were also tales of, at the same time, again, triumph and tragedy, there were tales of Native tribes that welcomed, helped, guided. In some cases, when the Arapaho or the Sioux or the Cheyenne retaliated, they would take the children with them, and those children would grow up learning the ways of the Sioux. They wouldn't kill them; they would teach them their ways and assimilate them in the tribe. Quite interesting. One of the more famous or infamous encounters occurs here. Little Bighorn. Montana, a legendary crazy horse and wise chief and religious leader, Sitting Bull, with 2,500 warriors. In June of 1876, another treaty is broken. There's a reservation in the South Dakota known as the Black Hills. The United States Army, after settlers had illegally gone in and discovered gold, they were then protected by the U.S. Army. Many Sioux and Cheyenne decided to leave the reservation, which they were not supposed to do. And they would go to Montana to join the Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. They're on the run. So they need to be recaptured and brought back to South Dakota. Others join them. So you have the Arapaho, you have the Cheyenne, and the Sioux. For thousands of years, these three were peaceful to each other at times. They traded with each other at times, and they were enemies at times. What's amazing about this is that they come together. That is one thing, if I may, for a second, just to step aside for, I think, besides from the beginning, when Columbus lands in the Bahamas and then the conquistadors follow and the English settle the 13 colonies, that disease did have a lot to do with what weakened Native American resistance to this. But I believe is a lack of their ability to form alliances for extended period of time. Many of the native tribes, they traded with one another. They went to conflict with one another. They didn't look at each other monolithically. In many instances, they wanted to join forces with the new settlers to even the score against their old enemies. That's how it's worked. That was their reality. And it prevented them from prohibiting European settlement west. It was the lack of their ability to ally themselves. Think about it, if there's 100 million Native Americans when Columbus arrives, if they all gathered together and said, no, we're not going to let this happen because our future's at stake, I don't think European settlement would have been as successful. In any event, in this case, the Sioux and the Cheyenne get together. The Battle of Little Bighorn fought on June 25th, 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, remember that name? George Armstrong Custer actually was a hero at Gettysburg. He was a general during the Civil War, but he got in trouble, and he was demoted down to lieutenant colonel. When he was a general during the Civil War, he fought bravely at Gettysburg in 1863. But he did not know exactly what number. He was supposed to pursue, capture, and send the Native Americans back to South Dakota, but he had no idea they had joined forces, and he had no idea how many there were. It ended up being between 2,500. Let me show you a brief video on this, the Battle of Little Bighorn. You can watch it in its entirety. This is just a little snippet. Okay, I got the sound share, and
it's one of the most crushing defeats in American history. Custer's last stand. June 25th, 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and over 600 troopers of the 7th United States Cavalry arrive in the Little Bighorn Valley of southern Montana. The cavalry has come to subdue a village of defiant Indians. Thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne under the leadership of the great holy man, Sitting Bull. For a century, the United States has pushed the frontier west, herding tribe after tribe onto agencies or reservations. The Sioux and the Cheyenne don't want to give up their land on the northern plains. These last defiant Indians gather into a colossal wandering village. In the spring of 1876, the village arrives on the plains of Montana.
The village was always on the move. They knew the Army was out after them. And to the United States Army, to capture a fleeing village was an impossible task.
Custer follows Sitting Bull's path west across the Wolf Mountains. On the other side, the Indian village stands on the banks of a slender river. The Indians call it the Greasy Grass. The Army calls it the Little Bighorn. On the morning of June 25th, Custer and his troops arrive in a treacherous landscape carved up into hidden channels and ravines. Perfect cover for fighters who know its contours. Deadly for the soldiers who don't. Around noon, Custer makes what many believe is his fatal mistake. He divides his forces into 3 separate columns. Custer heads up the bluffs along the river to attack from the north. It's his first clear look at the size of the village. He realizes he doesn't have enough troops to do the job. He sends a rider south with a note calling for more men and more ammo.
It's important to keep in mind that no one had any idea of how many Indians there would be. They simply had no idea.
Indians are surrounding Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his battalion. Survivors are struggling to join up with other troopers on nearby high ground. A spot now called Last Stand Hill.
The tables are turning for Custer. He's no longer the attacker, he's being attacked. Decides to take this high hill, which we call Last Stand Hill today. All the soldiers killed their horses to hide behind. A lot of the warriors said was they got close to this hill, they arched their arrows high into the sky, having those arrows come down behind those dead horses. They said, we rained arrows down on those men. Their shots quit coming, and we rushed up and we killed them all.
Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and over 200 of his men annihilated in a defeat that devastated America in 1876.
This battle, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, was the Plains Indians' greatest victory. This caused the government to send out more forces, more military.
Less than a year after the battle, Sitting Bull flees to Canada, and Crazy Horse surrenders in Nebraska. The Last Stand has been studied more closely than almost any military engagement in our history. Today, the battlefield still lies serene and empty, above the cottonwood trees lining the Little Bighorn River.
USS Enterprise had proven her steel at the
So just brief, there are more videos, more extended videos on that topic. So it's the last victory for Native Americans. Of course, the U.S. government will send more military troops. Retaliation will be brutal and fierce. And there's an example of towards the end of the video, you notice not too long after the Sioux, with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull had to flee. Crazy Horse is captured. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho go their separate ways. And it's hard to explain why. You'd come together, you have this major victory against the United States military, and then, okay, well, it's time to go home. And they're split once again. And that's that mysterious, how come they could not maintain alliances for long periods of time. This did mark the most decisive Native American victory, the worst U.S. Army defeat. The demise of Custer and his men, outraged, and here we go, many white Americans confirmed their images of the Indians as wild and bloody. They were the ones being pursued by Custer, by the U.S. military, to be captured and returned to a reservation where a treaty was broken because settlers came in and discovered gold, and they were being protected by the U.S. military. They escaped. They weren't the ones in search of this conflict. But when they came together and their scouts, observed that the U.S. military was coming for them, and then they took action. But, of course, they're going to be viewed as bloodthirsty and wild. Another chief who will face and be captured by the U.S. military, Chief Joseph Remember that name? You might see it again in the Nez Perce of Idaho. They were a small, peaceful village who managed to live without being bothered, but eventually the government would force them on a reservation. At times, like I said before, it wasn't always conflict. There were settlers and, traders that traded with Native Americans on a peaceful basis. That's why Native Americans learned to use firearms. And unfortunately, they were introduced to alcohol. Alcohol was never in thousands of years in North America. Alcohol was never made by any native tribe. Maybe a liquid form of peyote, uh, marijuana, but not alcohol. And the first introduction to it did not bode well for Native Americans and alcohol to this day on reservations. And unfortunately, some 4 young Native Americans or Indians were killed. They killed 4 white settlers. And but Chief Joseph decides instead of facing the U.S. military, he decides to escape. Almost made it to Canada, but he was basically surrounded, outnumbered, and he decides, well, I will fight no more forever. And if you look at that photograph of him, a picture can be worth 1,000 words. And look at his eyes. It's just complete despair, sadness, all of that would convey those emotions. Photograph was taken right before they would end up on a reservation. That's how close he came. Captured in Bear Paw Mountain. Almost made it. To the southwest, the more legendary, and the way Cochise and Geronimo were written, they would become, in a sense, there were many white Americans or Americans in the East who actually admired and respected the way they fought, how they fought, how long they lasted. It's Cochise at the top picture. He dies, hands of the U.S. military, and Geronimo replaces him and lasts for another 12 years until he is finally faced with 25,000 U.S. troops against he had ended up 12 years later with only 25 warriors, and he knew it was up. He was sent to a reservation in Oklahoma. Around this time, 1880s, 1890s, Barnum and Bailey Circus and Wild West shows became very popular. Traveling, entertaining Americans in cities and other places. And it was Wild Bill Hickok's Traveling Wild West show. What they would do is reenact battles between the military and the Native Americans, and Annie Oakley, the sharpshooters and gun skills contests, and cattle rustling and roping contests. And Wild Bill approached Geronimo and says, "Hey, you want to be a part of this? You're pretty famous." And Geronimo, break up the monotony of being on a reservation, says, "Hey, why not?" But being a part of the show, his part was humiliating in the end, because he would always have to surrender, or whatever crowds, wherever they went, not all crowds accepted him or respected him. I mean, there were a few, but for the most part, he'd hear jeers and have tomatoes or eggs and other items thrown at him when he appeared. And finally, he couldn't take the degradation, humiliation. He just said, Wild Bill, I'd rather live on a reservation with my dignity than to subjugate myself to this. And but there were journalists who were interested. There were settlers that did respect. It's not all hate and conflict. and sat down and actually wrote a book. He would die in Oklahoma on a reservation in 1913. I mentioned the first government policy was the concentration. In 1887, there's a bit of a change of heart, which, there's a double-edged sword to this. Known as the Dawes Act, you will see that again, and assimilation is part of let's break the Native American of their culture and make them more like us. Assimilate them. Teach them English. Make sure they forget their culture, their language. Cut their hair. Dress them properly. It's all part of this new, get their children, put them in boarding schools and teach them the white man's way. Teach them our way. Teach them the Christian way. Basically, civilize the savages. That was the new government policy. Now, those that wanted to remain on a reservation could, but some were forced off the reservation to be assimilated, mainly children. If you see here, this is one of the more famous, the Carlisle School. You see the children there. I think if I can kind of magnify it a little bit, you see there, maybe there's a better look. There's that. See the children, not too many of them smiling. A lot of the hair is trimmed, at least at the shoulders. They do have almost like uniforms on. So a lot of there have been accounts and movies depicting the abuse some of these children were subjected to at the hands of their instructors, who happened to be, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians, trying to break them of their culture. In some instances, punishment for some children could be to have their tongues cut out if they continued to speak their native tongue, whether it be Sioux or Navajo, Apache. So a lot of sad story, and also sexual abuse as well. Unfortunate. And then there's your triumph and tragedy. Some of the, when they're not monolithic, none of us are. Some of us are in that situation going to say, you know what, you can't beat them, join them. Accept it. It's a new way of life. Maybe I can be successful. And there were. And there are ones that fought it to the death, or lost their tongues, or were traumatized. We're not all going to act the same under those circumstances. And that applies to any racial group, ethnic group, any social structure or any social stratification. You just don't know. For the most part, I'm sure I can take a wild guess that 75% of those kids were going to fight it. They're going to be proud of their culture. We're going to maintain it. But you're going to have that 25% or so. Hey, it's a way for me to get out of here. I might make a better life for myself. Can't beat them, join. Still a sad chapter. At around the time of the late 1880s and 1890s, there was, let me type his name in there, a Sioux, Lakota Sioux medicine man named, make sure it's in red, Wavoka. And Wavoka had a vision of a dance, a very intense, a very passionate dance known as the ghost dance. Now, in the ghost dance, when it is performed, it's supposed to invoke the spirits of warriors that have died. So they will rise, maintain human form again. Basically they'll be reincarnated, come alive again, and they will join forces with the warriors that are still alive, and they will destroy further settlement of white settlers from Americans. And the dance was pretty effective. I mean, not that it, the spirits arose or anything, but what it did was put a fear into the soldiers. A lot of this was performed on reservations. it got to the point where, fingers got, nervous and, trigger happy on some reservations because soldiers were, it put fear in them. It was pretty intense. It was pretty passionate. Well, the dance is performed at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, the Lakota Sioux, on December 15th, 1890. At reservation, police tried to arrest Sitting Bull, the famous Sioux chief, who they mistakenly believed was a ghost dancer. He wasn't. It was Vivoka, and killed him in the process. So Sitting Bull dies on December 15th. He had been captured and brought to this reservation in Wounded Knee, South Dakota. A few days later, or well, actually a couple of weeks later, U.S. Army 7th Cavalry surrounded a band of ghost dancers. They continued to perform under Chief Bigfoot and demanded they surrender their weapons. Fight breaks out. Indian and U.S. soldier, and a shot was fired. Nobody knows where the shot came from, what side the shot came from. But what followed was a massacre. An estimated 150 Indians were killed. Some historians put this twice as high. However many, I mean, it's still a tragedy. It's still a massacre. Half of them were women and children. Cavalry only lost 25 men. Also, a new weapon was introduced to the U.S. military, a handheld machine gun. Really, the ghost dancers and the Native Americans, the Sioux, had no chance at all. I mean, there had been a form of it's called a Gatling gun. It's a big, it's a big gun that you crank and it revolves like a revolver from a pistol and fires, but it's cumbersome. You have to move it in the right, this is handheld. So, this is a brand new weapon that will be introduced and used in World War I later on. So it marks the end of conflict between Native. Wounded Knee is the last. Massacre was the last major battle, if you can call it that. The Indian Wars, this is it, 1890. And you remember and you're taking notes. 1876, Little Bighorn, George Custer, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. That's the last victory for the Native American, for the Sioux, for the Indians of the West. Okay, that's our last victory. Wounded Knee finishes them off. That's it. Wounded Knee, U.S. military, in a sense, if you want to call it that. And ironically, the 7th Cavalry, the same cavalry that lost and was defeated at Little Bighorn, gets its revenge at Wounded Knee, although unfairly. There's a summary of Native American leaders. Closing out, PowerPoint, women, challenging. This, and I remember I told you there was a level playing field, between the ethnic groups and the races, but women and gender. This is where the independence of women fighting alongside their husbands, working alongside their husbands. And in some cases, if they lost their husbands in a conflict, they took care of the family themselves. They did the farming. They learned how to shoot rifles and revolvers. And they, so to speak, the stereotype that women were weaker or everything else gets thrown right out the window. And many of these territories, women began to voice their political opinions, and they were part of the population. If you notice the geography of the United States and the way states are laid out, they're huge out west, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, so on and so forth. But the population is very small. So in order to become a state, 50,000 signatures, 50 to 60,000 signatures on a petition need to be sent to Washington, D.C. Well, many of the leaders that were men had to include women. So women were pretty savvy on that, especially in Wyoming. If you see that, for the first state to fight for women's right to vote, you want our signature, then give us the right to vote. It's pretty savvy. Pretty savvy maneuver. So, although there will not be a national amendment giving all women above the age of 18 the right to vote until 1920, that's right, women have only had the right to vote at a national level for 105 years. Women out west, state by state, were able to vote. That's how it all, gradually uh, would lead to 1920 and an amendment added to the Constitution that would all women and all American women citizens would get the right to vote. But on a state to state, it depended. Many cities, Western cities grew for several reasons. We went over them: railroad, mining, cattle, homestead. Cities and towns were rough. People took the law into their own hands. That photograph is from a famous movie, The OK Corral. That's actually, you got Gary Cooper, Kirk Douglas, uh, wow, Henry Fonda. Yeah, that's at that time. I don't know if you know whose names are, but that was an all-star cast. People who shaped the West were vaqueros, the cowhands who taught the Native Americans and the white settlers how to be cowboy. African Americans, Chinese immigrants, Native Americans, of course. There's always an exchange of ideas, even if one civilization considers the other to be inferior. Ideas do get exchanged, and sometimes the group that believes it's superior will actually adopt ideas from the so-called inferior civilization. Due to barbed wire and fencing, the frontier is closed. The Wounded Knee in the last battle, there was no more conflict. For the most part, Native Americans will be on reservations. And by 1890, the Census Bureau declared that the USA no longer had a frontier line. And for entertainment purposes, if you want to look at the last slide here, all the slang words that somehow, howdy, that's when I can, dude, fetch, fuss, all of those. I don't know about hobble your lip, whatever, and an apple pie order. Okay. The jig is up. I've heard that before. Pass the buck. Yeah. Skedaddle. That's for entertainment purposes. So that concludes the look at the West.